Hello, and welcome to APICS Extra Live, Calm Your Nervous MRP System, with Dave Turbide, CFPIM, CIRM, CSCP, CMfgE, CDDP. My name is Jennifer Storelli, Associate Editor at APICS. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we'll save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click Send. Should you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. Again, that's 1-805-617-7000. This presentation is being recorded and will be available at apics.org/extralive early next week. And now it's a pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dave Turbide is a New Hampshire-based independent consultant and freelance writer. He serves as president of the APICS Granite State Chapter, a certified in production and inventory management and certified supply chain professional master instructor, and a Fresh Connection trainer. In addition, he writes the Enterprise Insights Department of APICS Magazine, which is available in print, online, and in the APICS Magazine tablet app. Everybody, please give a warm welcome to Dave Turbide. Dave, you may begin.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone. Glad you're here. And we're going to talk today about MRP. Now, this is a presentation that I made at the International Conference last fall, and trimmed it a little bit to fit the format here, and also put it onto a calming blue background. So we'll try to stay with that theme today. Since you are an APICS audience, I'll assume you all know what MRP is. And since you came to this presentation, I'll also assume that you are in some way experienced with MRP and have seen that it can sometimes be somewhat frustrating. So we're going to talk about nervousness in an MRP system. Define that for you right up front. And then we'll talk about the causes for nervousness, and most importantly, how we can calm it down and make it work a little more smoothly and effectively for you. So, what is a nervous MRP? Well, basically, in a nutshell, it's too many action messages, too many recommendations. And I'm sure that most of you have experienced this. You'll do an MRP generation and then look at the screens or reports that list all the recommendations that have been made, and there may be thousands of them, or tens of thousands of them. Certainly far more than you can get through in a normal work day or work week or whatever the cycle is from between one generation and the next. The problem with that, the biggest problem with that, is you are faced with the task of trying to separate out the wheat from the chaff, trying to identify the really important messages, the things that need your attention and need action right away, from those that are trivial or at least not so important. And it's easy to get lost, and it's easy to get frustrated and depressed by all of this work that's dumped on your desk continually. And the real reason that this happens is that you have a lot of little things that are causing messages and warnings and problems. And it would seem like there should be a way to reduce those little things, or at least cover them up, or automatically take care of them in some way, so that you can focus on what's really important and what really needs your attention right away. So we're going to deal with those issues during the course of this webinar. So, what makes an MRP nervous? And I'm going to talk about three general things here. I guess you could say in increasing importance. First of all, the planning cycle. And this comes right out of the CPIM education material and exam content manual. And the standard APICS definition, or when it's addressed, when MRP nervousness is addressed, they'll tell you that it's really the planning cycle. You are running MRP at an improper frequency that's causing a lot of messages. So let's talk about planning cycle for a few minutes. And I've been around this business for a long time, a long time. And when I first got involved with MRP and MRP systems, this was back around 1980. And computers weren't very powerful back then. And the software, quite frankly, was a little bit on the primitive side in terms of calculation ability and sophistication of algorithms and so forth. And it was not unusual in those days that an MRP generation would take 15, 20, 25 hours to complete. And this is not even for a large company. A small or medium-sized company on the hardware that was available at that time would normally experience an extended wait for an MRP generation to complete. And what that meant was you just couldn't even consider running MRP more than once a week. Had to be done on the weekend because you had to have 20 or 30 hours of time where your system would essentially be down. When the MRP calculation takes place, you really can't do any bill of material maintenance, you can't do any inventory transactions, you can't release any new orders, and so forth. So that was the restriction then. Many companies run a monthly cycle. It kind of tickles me to think that I was working with a couple of IBM plants in that time frame in the early 80s, and they all ran MRP centrally in the big computer in the sky. This is before the days of cloud, but the corporate computer ran MRP for all the plants once a month. They would submit their information on cards through a remote job entry terminal. They go into the big corporate computer, they would get their results, and then had to live with those results for another month. So, obviously things have changed. Technology has advanced at a breakneck pace, and it wasn't very long into the 90s where we could do MRP generation in an hour or two. And then we got faster processors and smarter algorithms, and pretty soon, by the late 90s, we could do MRP in many cases in minutes. And that's still true today, of course. We can do a complete generation even on a very complex bill of material with lots and lots of items and lots of inventory and lots of orders. It's unusual for an MRP generation itself to take more than a few minutes at worst. So as users continue to take advantage of these new capabilities, new technologies, started to run MRP more frequently. We went from monthly or weekly cycles to a couple times a week to every day, in some cases every hour on the hour, or twice a shift, or whenever the spirit moved, every 10 or 15 minutes. Right? So that seemed like a really good thing, a really wonderful thing at the time to be able to do that. But companies generally, and I'm generalizing here, of course, but generally companies discovered that running MRP, every 10 minutes or every 20 minutes, not necessarily a good thing. Because what happens is you get new recommendations. You might have changes in priorities or due dates or something like that about ongoing activities, shop orders, purchase orders, and so forth. And they could be changing every 20 minutes. And that's chaos in the plant, chaos in the purchasing department, and really just unmanageable. So just because you can run MRP every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever, doesn't really mean you should. You really should find an interval that works for you, that gives you a manageable environment where you can respond to the recommendations without throwing the rest of the plant and the purchasing department into total chaos. So how often should you run MRP? Well, interesting to note that many companies have reverted back to pretty much a weekly schedule. Now, I know there's lots of exceptions, and again, this is just generalities here, but many companies have settled back, and some have reasons to run it more often than that, of course, but that's kind of the default. So if you think about, once a week MRP, or maybe twice a week if you've got some new orders and some changes that occur, run it on Wednesday night and then run it again on the weekend, that kind of thing. A lot of companies do it every day, once a day, but very few will do it more than once a day, just because there's just too much chaos, too much change, and too much in terms of recommendations and activities that have to take place to absorb it and to put it into effect. So weekly, perhaps, maybe twice a week, in some cases daily if you have a lot of changes, a lot of new orders coming in and things like that every day. And that's the kind of interval that you might have. Now, the interval will have an impact on the number of messages that you get and the quote-unquote nervousness of the plan. And that's the standard APICS answer, but I think we need to dig a little bit more deeply than that, because I think the real issue, or issues I should say, are the next two things that I'm going to be talking about here. Second of which is changes inside CMLT. Now, I'm not assuming that you're all familiar with CMLT. It continues to surprise me as I teach CFPIM classes that this is a foreign concept for a lot of folks. So let me just go through it briefly for you. And what we have here on the screen is a bill of material kind of laid on its side, so that the end item, the top level item, is off to the right. That's the one labeled A. A is made up of two components, or two assemblies I should say, B and C, and the final assembly lead time is 1 week, as you see here. Now B and C are both manufactured items. C is an assembly made up of an E and F with a 1 week assembly time, and then B is made up of two components, purchase components in this case, D and E, and the assembly time for B is 2 weeks. And so forth as we go down through the bill of material and look at all of the lead times for acquisition of the components and for assembly of those components into sub-assemblies, assemblies, and then the final product, laid on its side like this with the lead times all laid out on a timeline. And you can see that the total time to put this item together is 7 weeks, including all of the purchase and all of the intermediate activities for the assemblies and sub-assemblies. So you can think of this in terms of like a critical path. The critical path for this item is from G to F to C to A, right? So the important point here is we need to plan that item at least 7 weeks before we plan to have it completed and ready to sell, in order to be able to anticipate everything that's needed and put a complete plan together in enough time to execute it. So if we put our current date here on the left, as long as it's earlier than the left-hand end of that CMLT. CMLT, by the way, stands for Cumulative Material Lead Time. As long as it's to the left of that CMLT region, then we can make all the changes we want and they won't affect anything that has already started, right? So we have full freedom there to work with the master schedule. The master schedule being that final assembly schedule for A, that final week where we take the B and the C and we put them together and make an A out of them. That's the master schedule. Okay? So as long as we're at least CMLT into the future when setting that master schedule, we're good to go. Now, however, as time marches on and the current date moves forward like this, if we were to change that master schedule for item A, then it may have an impact on something that I started in the past. In this case, I released a purchase order for item G. looks like about 3 or 4 days ago. Now, if I change the master schedule for A, let's say I increase the quantity from 100 to 150, as it blows down through the MRP plan and gets to G, I may discover that that purchase order that I released 3 or 4 days ago for quantity 100 of item G now is not enough. I need to change that purchase order to 150. It could work the other way as well. If I change the master schedule down, now that order that I released a couple of days ago is too big. Okay, and that's what MRP will react to. It will tell me that that order is not big enough and therefore I need another one, or it'll tell me that I really don't need those items because I had enough left over in stock before, so I can defer the order, or maybe I don't need them at all and it'll tell me to cancel. But whatever the case is, it's likely to generate a message. Okay, so one of the biggest sources of recommendations or messages is a change to the master schedule within the CMLT, right? Because that will perhaps generate recommendations for things at the left-hand end of the diagram here. And as I get closer and closer to that master schedule date, then the more things are likely to be affected. Now, I didn't illustrate it in this slide, but if you can picture moving this red line to the right, and when it gets up, let's say, the 4-week point, then a change in the master schedule may impact plans for F, for E, for D, for E, and maybe some of the things I did before in getting G and D in place are insufficient. Okay, so the further to the right I get, or the closer I get to that master schedule date, then the more impact, the more messages, the more critical a change becomes in terms of nervousness and recommendations that will come out of the MRP. So, recommendation to you is don't change the master schedule inside of CMLT. Now, I realize that that's easy for me to say because I'm a consultant sitting here in my bunny slippers in New Hampshire looking out the window. If you're in the heat of battle trying to get a product out the door, especially if you're trying to respond to customers' unreasonable requests, which we all do every day, then that's a hard thing to do. So most companies will settle for something a little bit less than that and try to limit the changes within CMLT. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So one thing you can do, some systems will allow you to do this automatically, some MRP systems, some you have to go in and do it manually, but you may firm the master schedule when you're at that CMLT point. You're probably master scheduling 12, 18, 24 months ahead of time, and letting those schedules float as you replan, as you update the forecast and so forth. But when you get to that, what's called a planning time fence, or that CMLT time limit, then you'd be well served by firming the master schedule. You're probably not ready to release those final assembly orders. I hope you're not. You shouldn't be pre-releasing the orders. But you can make them firm planned orders, which tells the system not to change them without somebody's approval. Another thing you can do is work on reducing lead times. If you reduce lead times anywhere in that CMLT, especially anything on the critical path, then you are reducing the amount of time where you are compelled to limit changes or not accept changes. So you can make it a little bit easier on yourself if you can reduce lead times, particularly on the critical path items, so that you don't have to lock in that schedule quite as far out. Another thing you can do is improve forecast accuracy. That should be pretty obvious. Forecast is one of the key components that goes into the setting of the master schedule. And as the forecast changes, and it will change if it's inaccurate to begin with, 12 months out or 18 months out or wherever you start making those master schedule decisions, as it gets closer, it's likely to become more accurate. That's one of the natural qualities of forecasts, is they're more accurate the closer in. So as that forecast is refined, as it gets closer, you can expect to see changes or recommended changes to the master schedule based on recognizing the inaccuracies that were in the forecast further out. So if you can make the forecast more accurate to begin with, then you'll see fewer changes as you get closer to CMLT or within CMLT. And then the last recommendation here on this page is to, there's another one coming out, but establish and enforce a frozen zone. Now I'm going to bring in some more APICS terminology here, and all of you CFP or CPIMs out there will recognize this discussion, and that is the planning calendar. Starting at the current date on the left, looking forward out to the right, you'll see the planning time fence, and the planning time fence is essentially CMLT. Okay, so we're recommending that you limit changes to the master schedule within CMLT. That is, when those plans move inside of that planning time fence, you want to try to hold them if you can. So in blue here, outside of that planning time fence is flexible. Any change that you make out there is not going to impact anything that's currently ongoing. Have a ball. Knock yourself out, make all the changes you want. As long as you don't violate your resource availability, your capacity, then you're good to go. And you have resource checking, rough cut capacity planning, and resource planning out there to help you figure out if you're making those kind of mistakes. Once you cross inside of that planning time fence, we call the next range of time here the firm or slushy. APICS material now has liquid, slushy, and frozen. When I was a baby consultant, I learned frozen, firm, flexible. So in either case, within that range between demand time fence and planning time fence, you can make changes to CMLT, within CMLT, but they will likely have an effect on something that's already started, so you should check it out and try to lock that down the further and further you get inside of that planning time fence. And then finally, when you get to this demand time fence, you should freeze it. Now, how do you set the demand time fence? That can be done one of several different ways. And the kind of rule of thumb here is once you've crossed inside that demand time fence, then the master schedule should absolutely be frozen, because you have determined for your products and their lead times and processes and so forth that it's just not possible or not practical or not affordable to make a change to the master schedule when you're that far into it. Now you can set that demand time fence at the final assembly lead time, for example. In the case of the example I had up on the screen here a few minutes ago, that would be a week. So once I've started final assembly, forget about it. I'm not going to change that master schedule. And that makes sense, right? You probably don't even have the components you need at that point, or you don't want to be stuck with half-finished products if you dump them partway through that final assembly process. So it doesn't make intuitive sense or logical sense to change the master schedule that late in the game. Another way you can set the demand time fence is if you are selling a product where the customers expect shipment at a certain point in time. For example, in your industry, customers will call with an expectation of shipment in 2 weeks. Then that's the customer expected lead time, and you can set that as your demand time fence. And that works well with APICS theory on master scheduling and available to promise, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. And that says that at that point in time, I have all the orders I'm going to get, likely. All right. If customers normally order with an expectation of 2 weeks shipment, then they're going to call the next order that comes in is not going to expect shipment in less than 2 weeks. So therefore, I have all the orders I'm going to have. So I can use that approach to consume my forecast and light a fire under the salespeople or whatnot to try to bring it into line with what I expected the forecast or expected sales to be for that near-term window. All right, so my last point here is about ATP. Available to Promise is one of my favorite things. It is not widely used and not widely recognized, and that's a real shame. A lot of companies have a serious issue with saying no to a customer. I'll pause for some chuckles. Everybody has that issue, pretty much. Customer calls and says, I need X and I need it next week, and so what if the lead time is 4 weeks? If you want that business, you're going to say yes to the customer. And that's the way your salesmen are trained, and that's the way they're motivated, and that's the way they're paid. They're paid on revenue, right? So they're not going to turn down an opportunity, regardless of whether it's realistic or not, and regardless of what kind of chaos it causes in the shop, and regardless of whether the expediting and the premium freight and the overtime and all that cause you to lose money on the order. That doesn't matter. He wants the order. He's going to take the commission no matter what. All right. So one way to help add some sense or at least some visibility to that process is Available to Promise. You put your master schedule in place based on a forecast, at least partially on a forecast. And then as you start to execute that plan and you move forward in time till you get to the point where you're in that forecast period, okay? A year ago you forecasted what sales were going to be in March of 2016. Now it's approaching March of 2016. You may have refined the forecast, but at some point in time, that's the forecast you have, and that's what you're going to live with. So now it's March, and you have a forecast that says, and a master schedule that says you're going to have 500 of that particular item to sell in the month of March. Now ATP will keep a running count of how many you've actually sold. So as your orders are booked in your system, ATP keeps track. We had 500 on the master schedule, and we have now sold 140 of them. They haven't shipped yet. Still early in the month. We're just collecting orders, and some of the orders came in last week, and some came in the week before, but they're due for shipment in the early days of March. So we're going to keep a running count of that. Therefore, the next customer that calls in and says, I need 400 of these things, and I need them tomorrow, the salespeople can look at that Available to Promise and say, I'm sorry, we only have 358 still available to ship in March. Okay? Now, what I could do for you, Mr. Customer, is I can ship you, let's say, 250 of them tomorrow or next week, and then the remainder will ship to you the second week in April. We won't charge you extra for double shipping, and you probably don't need them all right now anyway, so it will help you reduce your inventory. Such a good deal for both of us, right? But you can't make that kind of an offer unless you have this information. So Available to Promise is a really nice tool. It helps keep the demand side of the business in touch with what's happening on the supply side of the business so that they are less inclined to make unrealistic promises that are going to throw chaos and extra costs and so forth into the production side of the business. So that's my little lecture on Available to Promise. I encourage you all to take a good look at it and see if you can fit that into your operations and get your sales force aligned with the realities of the production side of the business and for everybody's benefit. I think you'll be glad you did. All right, so the third one, and this is probably the biggest contributor to nervousness in the MRP, and it's one that can be addressed directly with great results. Excuse me. And that is, I've labeled here, no room for error. Lack of accommodation for life's little realities. We live in an unstable world. And MRP, by its very nature, is a just-in-time system. In other words, in a perfect world where we had no variability, no errors, forecasts were 100% accurate, and everything was completed on time, then we could operate with essentially zero inventory. All our components would come in the day they're needed. They'd go right up to the production line, get made into products, and those products would ship whenever as soon as they're finished, and everybody would be happy, and the world would be a wonderful place. However, of course, we don't live in a world that's perfect. Stuff happens. Receipts are late. We have higher than expected scrap or lower yield. We have unusable parts come in from suppliers. Bills of material and inventory records are inaccurate. Forecasts are inaccurate by nature. So all these things happen, and those are all variability. They are things that are outside of or different from what we assumed they would be when we put the plan together. Okay, the plan reacts to what you said the world was like in the bill of material and the inventory and the forecast and so forth. And when those things turn out not to be true, then the system will scramble and try to make up for it. And that's the messages you get. So if I don't have any buffers, any accommodation for these variabilities, then I'm going to see messages. I have a purchase order out there for 100 of a particular component. And you know, a week after I've released the purchase order and a week before it's due to come in, I run another MRP generation, and that discovers that maybe I did an inventory cycle count in the past week, and I found that the current supply of that particular item is one less than I thought it was supposed to be, right? And it happens that it makes it short for the order that needs it tomorrow. So MRP is going to say, oh, that purchase order you released last week for 100, now you've got to expedite it in and get it in tomorrow because next week is not early enough, because you got to have to cover this shortage of one that just turned up in the latest MRP generation. Well, you're not going to do that, right? So this is kind of a spurious message. And if you had an extra thing or two on the shelf, you wouldn't even see the message, right? And that's the whole idea behind safety stock and the other buffers. Throw a little bit of extra inventory in there just in case. So if we do have an unexpected shortage, you know, a loss, something disappears, or, you know, the bill of material was in error by a little bit or something, then it's not going to cause an expedite message. It's not going to cause another order to be generated inside a lead time to try to rush another one in to cover it. Okay, so what we're talking about here is primarily safety stock. The things like shrinkage factors, yield and scrap factors, padded lead times, things like that, they're all going to generate a little bit of extra inventory, but hopefully it's enough to cover over these little variabilities that happen every day, and then you don't get the messages. Okay. So simple as that, cause and effect, right? So if you're getting too many messages, especially messages generated by very small changes or shortages, onesies and twosies, then you don't have enough safety stock. You don't have enough factors, compensating factors in your planning system. Now, I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek. Most companies, the truth be told, most companies don't really understand or use all these other factors. Everything gets dumped into safety stock. And safety stock is usually too high. It's usually a lot higher than it really needs to be because it's done kind of seat of the pants. The next slide, we'll talk through that a little bit. All right. So most companies have too much safety stock, but it's lack of safety stock, a lack of compensating factors here that are causing nervousness in your MRP. So it's kind of a dilemma here that we have too much of something that we don't have enough of. All right, and the real answer here is we don't have the right amount of safety stock on the right items at the right time. And the extra that we have where it's not needed is what's causing the overall amount of inventory to be too high. All right, so let's explore that. How do you set safety stock? Well, most companies use the system default or whatever the consultant recommended when they installed their new MRP system 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it was, right? So these are usually seat of the pants kind of things, or the peanut butter approach, where you just take one number and spread it evenly across everything, right? So that's the way safety stock normally gets set, at least at the beginning, right? And then another approach is SWAG, scientific wild guess, okay? And I say scientific just to give it a little credibility. It's really not scientific, it's just a wild guess. So, you know, people pull these numbers out of the air and they just throw them in there, you know, kind of by a hunch or inspiration, and there's really nothing behind it. That's not a good thing either. So the other thing about safety stock is it almost always goes up and almost never comes down. So what happens here is, you know, you set your system up and you take your consultant's recommendation or the system default or whatever, and you throw in 50 units of safety stock on everything. Well, you get a couple of items that have shortages, right? And the first shortage you might just ignore, depending on how busy you are and whether how much heat you got when that happened. Second time you get a shortage on that same item, your knee-jerk reaction is probably to just go out and raise the safety stock, right? We're going to make that one 75 now, and we're going to leave it at 75 unless we have another shortage, and then we'll raise it to 100. And that's what happens. We react with safety stock to isolated incidents. And to a certain extent, we kind of have to. You know, that isolated incident is telling us that we don't have enough safety stock. The variability is too high, and it's not being covered. However, we tend to overreact when we do that. We will raise it until we get no more shortages, and in fact, that's probably way too much inventory, and we should be aiming for something like, you know, maybe 90% coverage or 95% coverage or something like that. And you can calculate these numbers, and you can do it sensibly, and that's what I'm going to recommend to you. But that's not the way it's normally done. It's normally done just as in reaction mode. I say almost never down because it does come down from time to time. You'll get a new owner, a new manager, a new hotshot in the finance department that says, we got too much inventory, right? And they'll say, come out to you as operations folks and say, we've got to lower inventory by 10%. So what's the easiest way to lower inventory? Well, let's go out and just do a mass change on all our safety stocks, right? Let's take them all down 25%. You can do that with a couple of keystrokes. You know, across the board, your inventory will come down. Everybody's happy until you start getting the shortages again, and then you go in and you start raising it item by item every time you have a shortage, and then pretty soon you're back to where you were before you lowered it. Right? So that's not a really intelligent or sustainable way to maintain your safety stock. So what I'm recommending to you is a more reasoned, systematic, risk-based approach, and let me just outline that for you briefly. So first of all, you need to segment your items. You can't really do one policy for safety stock for everything. You need to look at finished goods, raw materials, fab parts, assemblies separately. At least raw materials, manufactured parts, and finished goods. And then you want to separate them out, high volume and low volume items, high risk and low risk. What I mean by that is high variability and low variability items. And then set an intelligent policy for each of those subgroups. All right, you put a higher level of safety stock on the high volume, high risk items, a lower level of safety stock on the high volume, low risk items, and so forth and so on. But you just go through and put that all into a grid, a chart, and just apply some common sense to it. And then my type of group, develop policy for each group, and then monitor how well it works. Again, you're still going to be looking for shortages. When you do have shortages, go back and look at the items, understand what groups they're in, and if they are properly assigned to those groups, then you may want to change safety stock. If you're really into this and really want to do well and do the right thing, then rather than change safety stock, I would look into the cause of variability. Is it because your forecast is particularly inaccurate? Is it because you're having trouble maintaining the quality on that item? Do you have a vendor that's always late? Those kind of things. So rather than just blindly raise the safety stock level, maybe you should do a little detective work and go back and try to figure out the causes of variability. And then if you can address that and bring it down, then the safety stock is probably adequate. Or maybe you could even reduce it and lower your overall inventory. So that's a continuous improvement approach that will pay big dividends in reduced inventory and increased availability over time. But at the very least, at the start, you should take a good look at safety stock. Figure out why you've assigned the numbers that you have, and perhaps take a look at it from this viewpoint by segregating the items into high and low volume, high and low risk by type of item, and then do a reasoned scientific or intelligent assignment of safety stock, and then maintain it based on performance from that point on. So that's my recommendation to you. Oh, by the way, on that last slide, don't forget shrinkage, safety lead time, yield, etc. This is kind of an advanced topic for most folks. Safety stock is the default. Everybody uses safety stock to cover just about everything that could go wrong. Really, you should use these compensating factors where they belong, where they're designed to be used. So you shouldn't be covering shrinkage and yield and quality issues and all of that with safety stock. You should be using the proper factors for those, and then use safety stock just for variability. And then then you can intelligently look at each of these factors and do your cause and effect and try to make them better, and then reduce those factors, which will reduce your inventory and improve performance. Okay, so that's that. So measurements for MRP, just in case you're interested, and because all of the APICS material ends every chapter in CPIM and CSCP with measurements. So we'll stay with the general program here, and talk about how you measure MRP success. Well, one measure is the number of action messages by type: expedites, defers, cancels, so forth. And as you get control, as you start to address these issues and reduce variability and stabilize your schedule and so forth, you should see those number of messages go down. And that's a sign of success, a sign that you've gained control and the system is working better for you. Inventory level. It's a funny thing that companies will go out and they'll spend millions of dollars for a new ERP system or MRP system, and most often the ROI analysis, the return on investment, the payback, a good portion of that is inventory reduction in almost every case. And in the hundreds of companies I've worked with over the last 35 years, that's always the big one. We're going to spend $2 million for this ERP system, and we're going to save $500,000 a year in inventory, because this is going to be able to plan better for us, and we won't have all this extra stuff out there. Well, what happens most often is you install this new system, and even if you do it well and do it right, install the new system, and inventory goes up, and heads roll. Well, what happens is, because you are planning more effectively, you're not expediting stuff in last minute, and because you probably have a lot of these compensating factors and extra lead time because you don't trust your suppliers and that kind of thing. So stuff is coming in early and too much because you've got these compensating factors in there. You don't have really control of the processes that are generating all that variability. So you get that extra inventory coming in that would have been expedited in before the new MRP system went in place. And you've got all that other extra inventory you had before, and it's going to take a while to work that off. So it's natural and it's normal to see an increase in inventory after you flip the switch on your new MRP, even if you did everything right. What brings it back down and then gives you the savings is when you start addressing these variability and control issues, as we just talked about in the previous couple of slides. And that is, we set the safety stock level where it should be. We set the yield and the shrinkage factors and the lead times where they really should be, so you're not bringing in a lot of extra stuff and a lot of stuff early to compensate for the lack of control and the lack of stability. Then your inventories will come down, and you'll see those savings that you planned on when you made the investment. But it doesn't come automatically, and it doesn't come right away, because you have to get the system in place, let it bring in that extra inventory so that your availability goes up and your expediting goes down. Then, as you get control, you can take these compensating factors down, and that will bring your inventory down. So shortages, obviously, is something very important, and that MRP should dramatically decrease the number of shortages. And if it's not, then you need to look into these compensating factors and lot sizes and lead times and all that to see why it's not working for you. On-time completion and on-time delivery, of course, the ultimate measure of how well you're doing. All the pieces have to come together well and correctly to do that. Expedites in the plant. Orders that are released that are already behind schedule. And that's an indicator of unrealistic manufacturing lead times in MRP. Kind of an odd artifact of the way MRP systems are designed. You have lead time detail in your production control system, but the lead times that MRP uses in planning are manually controlled in virtually every system that I've seen. So, you know, there's a disconnect there, and a lot of companies don't really understand that, and they don't make the effort to ensure that the lead times in your planning system are realistic, based on what actually happens out in the plant day to day. Right? So here's one of the things that can tell you whether how that's working. As you release orders, as you get order release recommendations, are they in the future, or is the release date in the past, so that they're already behind schedule? You know, when you get the shop scheduler gets to them. And then early deliveries. You know, if you're telling your suppliers to deliver early because you don't trust them to be on time, you need to work with those suppliers and make the lead times realistic so that they're delivering reliably just when it's needed. So that'll reduce your inventory too. All right, so nervousness is too many action messages, particularly a lot of insignificant action messages or messages that were generated because of small differences or small expected shortages. And that's the way the system is telling you that, one, your planning cycle is too short, which is the APICS primary reason for nervousness. Or what I'm telling you is changes inside of CMLT and not enough compensating factors, wiggle room, to accommodate the everyday variabilities. So what you need to do is establish the right planning cycle, whatever that happens to be in your situation, limit the changes inside of lead times, and then take a systematic approach to setting your safety stock. And further, there should be another bullet on here that says, try to understand where the variability is coming from, and then fix the cause before you just throw extra inventory at it, which is what you're doing with safety stock. So at this point, we have about 5 or 10 minutes. We can take some questions, and let's do that.
Great, thanks so much, Dave. So I'll give you a few minutes to send in your questions. As a reminder, look at the right toolbar on your screen and type your question in the questions box and click send. So Dave, we've gotten a couple questions about safety stock so far. Although I really liked your description of it as a scientific wild guess, our listeners want to know if there's a rule of thumb that they should follow when planning their safety stock.
That's a question a consultant absolutely loves. The answer is no. No, it depends, which is a standard consultant answer for everything, right? No, it depends on the volume, the variability. You have to remember that safety stock really, at least in theory, is just to cover variability, the things you don't know and the things you can't control. All right. So if you look at it in terms of variability, then yeah, you can come up with some reasonable rules of thumb, but they all have to do with standard deviation, right? If we look at how much variability we experience with this item over time, we can make a reasonable guess about what safety stock should be to cover a certain amount of that variability, expected variability, over whatever lead time it takes to replenish, right? So you can put science behind it, put some math behind it. But as far as a rule of thumb that says safety stock ought to be 10% of the inventory balance or something like that, no such thing. And even if there was, it would be unrealistic and unenforceable.
Great. And do you have any tips for improving forecast accuracy?
Lots of them, and there's lots of resources. In fact, there have been some APICS webinars on that, and there's been some really good webinars from some of the forecast software suppliers. So you might do some Bing searches or Google searches, and you can find some of those things. Forecasting is not fun, although it can be if you're a math nerd. But it's a difficult thing to do. You know it's going to be wrong. Nobody likes to be wrong. You know it's going to change. But there are some fantastic tools out there, some very affordable tools, cloud-based and PC-based tools. Your ERP system may already have tools built in, and there's really no shortcuts to forecasting. You just have to gather as much data as you can, collaborate with your customers, enlist all the help you can get from anybody that might know anything at all about your customers and their needs and the markets and so forth. And do the best you can and keep trying to refine your techniques. There's really no magic to it.
Thanks. Our next question is a little bit detailed. Our viewer asks, when you have an ERP system implemented, and of course you want to use it to better do your inventory planning, but you have some problems around BOM and inventory count issues such as inaccuracy. So in a situation like that, how would you approach the entire process to better utilize the new ERP?
Well, you really have to address those issues. It's garbage in, garbage out. If your inventories are not accurate, if your bills and materials have errors in them, then MRP is really not going to work that well for you. You resort to lots of safety stock, and that's going to bloat your inventories, and you're still going to have shortages. So there's no easy answer to that. You really have to bite the bullet and dig in and work on those accuracy issues. The only real answer on the inventory accuracy side is cycle counting. Cycle counting is a beautiful thing. It's well known and proven. You want to know about it, again, do a search and you can find lots of information about it. It's in all the APICS CPIM materials. Cycle counting, without cycle counting, and I've seen this in many companies, if you don't have cycle counting and you do just an annual physical, or I've worked with companies that have done an annual physical every month, but they still call it an annual physical, strangely enough. It's not unusual in that kind of a situation to have a 40% accuracy on your inventory. It just blows me away. How can you expect to operate with any kind of success if your inventory is 60% wrong? And what I mean by that is if I go out and randomly count 100 different items, 60 of them are going to have an error of some sort. Maybe a little tiny error, but it's an error nonetheless, right? But if you start cycle counting, you start with a control group for a couple of weeks, and then you cycle into a normal cycle. In the course of a month or two, you can bring that 40% accuracy up to 80, 85%. Another month or two, you can bring it up to 90%. And then you go from 90 to 92 is probably going to take you another month or two. But inside of 6 months, you should be in the mid-90s easily if you're serious about it and if you do it right. And then you can maintain that level of accuracy and continue to improve it with cycle counting without a whole lot of extra effort and work. It's almost magical. It's really, really good, really effective. As far as the bill of materials accuracy, you can use that same inventory data as long as you have good reporting for what you actually use when you build the products. You know, if your production people will go to the stockroom and they'll pull the parts that are on the bill, and then they have to go back and get some more, or they have some left over. They need to report that, and then you have to have somebody in the cycle, in the process, to look at those manufacturing records after the orders are completed and validate the bills and collect statistics on that, and then maintain the bills to reflect what's actually used day to day out in the plant. So you're going to need some discipline out on the plant floor to make sure that those additional issues or the returns are actually processed, so they get into the records, and then have somebody in the process to look at those manufacturing records after the fact and validate the bills that way. Practically, that's a much better approach than having an engineer go through and try to do it, you know, based on the drawings and that kind of thing. That's very expensive and time-consuming and not very effective way to do it. You're building the stuff every day. Use that information.
Great, thank you. And we also have a couple of questions about what would you say, in your experience, are the best MRP and ERP solutions that are available on the market?
Can't answer that question. MRPs and ERP systems are far more alike than different. The ERP suppliers don't like to hear me say that, but it's the truth. I've seen a lot of them, I've worked a lot of them, and 90% of them do pretty much the same thing in pretty much the same way. Where they differ is in on the edges, in the additions and the tailoring that they've made to make it fit specific situations. So you may have an ERP system that's marketed specifically for food and beverage. Well, that has some extra things, that extra 10% that's around the edges that satisfy the specific needs of food and beverage industry. So it has the manufacturing records for quality control and auditability and that kind of thing. It has the lot number traceability and that kind of stuff. You might have another one that's specifically for the automotive industry, automotive suppliers, and they have the serial number tracking and configuration control and that kind of thing for automotive, and they have the EDI links to the OEM ordering system that's done through electronic data interchange, and they have the release accounting and that kind of thing. So, but the 90% of it, the majority of it, and the heart of the system that addresses the issues we've talked about today is almost identical in virtually every ERP system that's out there. So if you're looking at a new system and you want to choose one, look for the one that addresses those fringe issues, the ones that are specific to your industry. And I think you can safely assume that the basics, the way MRP works, the way safety stock works, and the planning cycle and that kind of thing, are pretty much alike with any system.
Great, thank you.
One more?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. One of our viewers asked, will DDMRP by Carol Patak be an alternative for MRP in the near future?
Great question. Carol, did you ask that question?
No, she did not.
You may have noticed that I had the CDDP on my under my name there. I am a certified demand-driven planner. So I know what DDMRP is all about. DDMRP is not a replacement for MRP. It is an enhancement to MRP. MRP still does its planning thing. What DDMRP does is it enables a unique execution process that takes that basic plan and makes it more adaptable and more responsive in today's fast-moving and highly variable marketplace. Okay, so the main complaint that most companies have with MRP is it's bulky, it's not responsive, it's not flexible enough because things move a lot faster today than they did 50 years ago when MRP was first developed. So DDMRP puts some lean and theory of constraints kind of tools in place that allow you to release and execute orders and move work through the plant and move inventory in and out of the plant more effectively and more responsively. But it's an addition to and an enhancement of MRP, not a replacement.
Great, thanks, Dave. That's all the questions we have time for today. If your question was not answered or you have additional questions, you can contact Dave at the information on your screen. And so now we'd like to
thank you all for coming, and thank you all for staying right through to the bitter end. That's great.
Great, and also on behalf of APICS, we would like to thank you, Dave, for your time today, and all of our attendees for listening in on this APICS Extra Live webinar. All content and materials included in this edition of APICS Extra Live are the property of APICS and Dave Turbide and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved. Thanks so much for joining us.